Testing, 1, 2, test.
Yeah, sounds, it's got sound, so let me just try and make it go down.
Test, 1, 2. Mic check for the reporter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Looks good.
Yeah. Okay, let me try mine.
Okay.
Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Testing. Is that good?
Good morning. Before we begin today's markup, we need to welcome Representative Connor Lamb to the Committee on Veterans Affairs. Congressman Lamb represents Pennsylvania's 18th Congressional District. He served on active duty in the United States Marine Corps from 2009 to 2013 and continues to serve as a major in the Marine Corps Reserves. Representative Lamb also served as an Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Justice Department's Pittsburgh office. Congressman Lamb, let me begin by thanking you for your continued service to the Marine Corps Reserve. I don't have to tell you, but the members of this committee have the high privilege of honoring the nation's veterans and their families through our work. As a veteran myself, I find it extremely rewarding to serve my brothers and sisters in arms, and I too hope that you have such a deeply rewarding experience. With that, we have vacancies on both the Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs and the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation. We will now fill our subcommittee vacancies. The members have a copy of the resolution in their packets, and I recognize Ranking Member Walls for resolution.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding this business meeting. Thank you to each of you, and welcome, Representative Lamb. We are grateful for you being here. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, as a veteran, is going to bring his experience to this committee, and he's going to find very quickly and in today's markup what bipartisanship can look like, what healthy debate will look like, and what a common purpose of care for our veterans will look like. And so the resolution approving our subcommittee is in front of each of you. I would ask each of you to adopt it and bring Mr. Lamb into the fold, and we are grateful, sir. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. I now recognize Representative Takano for a motion on the resolution.
Mr. Chairman, I'm honored to move that the committee adopt the resolution offered by Mr. Waltz, providing for the additional minority membership of the standing subcommittees of the Committee on Veterans Affairs in the 115th Congress.
There's a motion to add Representative Lamb as a Democratic member of the Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs and the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. All in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Representative Lamb, welcome to the House of Representatives on the Veterans Affairs Committee. This concludes our business meeting for today. Immediately following this meeting, we will turn to a markup. The meeting is adjourned. Good morning. The committee will come to order, and I thank all of you all for being here. We're here today to consider a number of bills sponsored by members from both sides of the aisle that would address a wide spectrum of critical issues facing our nation's veterans and the Department of Veterans Affairs. I would also like to take a moment to recognize today is the 73rd anniversary of VE Day. This past week, myself and several members of this committee participated in a wreath-laying ceremony on the beaches of Normandy to honor the brave men who stormed the beaches many years ago. Without the American heroes who fought in the Second World War, we wouldn't enjoy the freedoms we do today. Today, on the anniversary of VE Day, let us take a moment of silence to honor their service and their sacrifice. Thank you. I will say that it was to be there and to lay that wreath was one of the most moving things I've had the privilege to do since certainly I've been in the U.S. Congress, and it's really an amazing place, Normandy, along with the other cemeteries that we were fortunate enough to visit. Our agenda is full, so I will forego any further comments and yield to Ranking Member Walsh for any opening remarks that he may have before turning to the task at hand.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for making the trip and representing us in Europe, and I appreciate you doing that. And I think all of us who have been to those monuments and battlefields know how special that is. I want to give a special thank you to you and your staff for bringing so many great bipartisan bills forward for this agenda. I want to thank you specifically and to the veteran service organizations who are here on finding a bipartisan solution to H.R. 299, the Blue Water Navy Act of 2017. Lots of folks in here have been with this one for a long time, finally granting the same Agent Orange presumptions for Vietnam veterans serving on the ground in Vietnam to Navy veterans exposed to Agent Orange. I know it was not easy to find the pay for. You set exactly where you're at today, pledged to work together to go back and try and find that, and like you always do, you have found the path forward, and for that I am grateful. Personally, I'd like to thank you on two pieces of legislation that I will be sponsoring, the Medicinal Cannabis Research Act of 2018 and VA Electronic Health Records Modernization Act, two things we'll talk about a little later that are really important. And I want to give a special thank you, and to the whole committee as we're here, a thank you to you personally, Chairman, and to the minority and specifically the majority staff for working on H.R. 5674, the Mission Act. The good faith effort that was put forward on this, the exact way you would expect Congress to work, the compromises that the chairman made to the minority side were everything that we could ask to try and get. The legislation has some issues that I'm going to put forward some amendments on, not because of anything that happened here, but because it has to be acceptable to the White House. And I understand that. And I understand in a democracy the way that works. But your willingness to work with us, your willingness to find compromise, your willingness to give us those compromises when we need it, I say this as the ranking member of this committee and as a member of Congress, is a model for all of us moving forward. I say it as a friend. Thank you for giving us that courtesy and the work you did, and look forward to, just like we always do, continuing to find solutions for our veterans. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And this bill, H.R. 299, I ask unanimous consent to call up to the table H.R. 299, the Blue Water Navy Vietnam Veterans Act of 2017. Without objection, so ordered. The clerk shall report.
H.R. 299, to amend Title 38 United States Code to clarify presumptions relating.
The bill was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill is now open for amendment at any point, and I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk. The clerk shall report.
Amendment in nature substitute to H.R. 299, offered by Mr. Rowe of Tennessee.
I ask unanimous consent that further reading of my amendment in the nature of a substitute be dispensed with. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I am pleased that this committee is finally marking up this bill. H.R. 299 was introduced by Representative Valadao of California, would extend the presumption of exposure to Agent Orange to Blue Water Navy veterans. The Blue Water Navy veterans are currently prohibited from receiving the presumption of exposure to Agent Orange because VA's policy is to limit the presumption to veterans who actually set foot in Vietnam or served in the inland waterways, the brown water. As a result, thousands of Blue Water Navy veterans have been denied benefits for conditions they may have developed because they came into contact with herbicides. VA denies these benefits because it claims there's not enough information to determine whether Blue Water Navy veterans came into contact with Agent Orange. And unfortunately, too much time has passed for us to know with certainty what the effects of herbicides were on veterans who served in the territorial seas of Vietnam. I believe this bill is long overdue. I've been contacted routinely by Blue Water Navy veterans who are suffering from diseases associated with Agent Orange. VA estimates that there are 6.6 million living Vietnam veterans and that there will be only 4.4 million veterans in 10 years. We lose an average of 523 Vietnam veterans each day. In a few years, there will be very few Vietnam veterans remaining. We owe it to the brave veterans who served offshore during the Vietnam War to provide compensation benefits for conditions they may have developed because of exposure to Agent Orange. I'm not the only one that believes this. H.R. 299 has broad bipartisan support with 329 co-sponsors. On a personal note, I think General Bergman and myself and Dr. Dunn are the only ones on this dais of the generation who served during Vietnam. We have people that we know who died in Vietnam or because of their exposure to Agent Orange in service. I've met men in the Blue Water Navy, and that this is the last remaining part of the presumption that we need to deal with, and we have not done it. I don't want to repeat the mistake we made in World War II veterans by waiting to deal with mustard gas exposure until there were only 400 left. We have read the science, I've read it, and it's difficult to prove the exposure scientifically at this date. However, the presumption ought to be in favor of the veteran. Unfortunately, one of the reasons we have not been able to move forward on this bill is because the Congressional Budget Office estimates it would cost approximately $1 billion in just mandatory funds. We needed to find a bipartisan path forward because Blue Water Navy veterans should not have to wait any longer. I am so pleased to sit here today and tell you that I think we're finally going to be able to move this bill out of the committee. My amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 299 would fix the inequity that currently exists for benefits for veterans who serve in Vietnam. As I said, I have strong feelings that this committee needs to finally extend the Agent Orange presumption to Blue Water veterans. In addition to helping the Blue Water Navy veterans, my amendment in the nature of a substitute would also address a few other issues, several of which are associated with Agent Orange. For example, VA presumes exposure to herbicides by veterans who served on or near the DMZ in Korea beginning on April 1, 1968. However, VA provides benefits to children of veterans who have certain birth defects if their parents served along the Korean DMZ beginning in September of 1967. This discrepancy means that under current law, a veteran can be denied benefits for conditions associated with Agent Orange, but their child could receive benefits. My amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 299 incorporates a proposal authored by Representative MacArthur, which would remedy this discrepancy by extending the presumption to veterans who served on or near the Korean DMZ beginning on 1 September 1967, which is when the military began testing herbicides in that area. Finally, these veterans will receive the same start date for eligibility as their children. My amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 299 would also help children who were born with spina bifida if one or both of their parents may have been exposed to Agent Orange while serving in Thailand. This provision would require VA to provide health care, compensation, and vocational training for these children, just as VA does for children with spina bifida if their parents served in Vietnam and the Korean DMZ while Agent Orange was used. We have worked with our colleagues to identify an acceptable way to pay more than $1 billion cost of this bill, while at the same time including several enhancements to the VA Home Loan Guarantee Program. This amendment has the support of the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign War of the United States, the Disabled Veterans, the Vietnam Veterans of America, the Fleet Reserve Association, the Military Order of the Purple Heart, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, the Blue Water Vietnam Veteran Association, Military Veterans Advocacy, and the Military Officers Association of America. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 299. Do any members wish to comment? Mr. Walls, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It would be an understatement to say how happy we are to be here today. I say this as a Minnesota Lutheran. We have a saying that if you do a good deed and talk about it, it doesn't count. So the way we get around that is we have other people talk about it for us. So I'm going to talk about Dr. Rowe's role in this, and he is a humble man who will not ask nor seek recognition for this, but his leadership is profoundly changing the care of our veterans by doggedly sticking to finding a way to make sure Blue Water Navy veterans were cared for. We set on the precipice today of being able to do this. And Dr. Rowe explained clearly why we're doing this, what we're doing. The challenge has been to pay for, and I ask the members here to remember, probably the biggest dust-up we've had in quite some time came over this piece of legislation the first time it was up. And we could have chosen to do the route that appears to be pretty standard around here, is to dig into our own corners, blame each other, and then let that thing lay. Dr. Chairman Rowe chose not to do that and chose to immediately come back and find out what can we do to make this work together. That's why we're sitting here today. We're sitting here today with a pay-for that everyone is able to accept, everyone understands there's a fairness to it. We're going to take care of those veterans. Those types of things do not happen without leadership. They do not happen without commitment. They do not happen with all of us understanding our sacred duty is to provide for those veterans. So for all the good things that are in here, one of the ways, not in just providing these benefits to those Vietnam veterans, we're also doing it and honoring their service by the way we're conducting ourselves. And once again, I would say this, Chairman Rowe's leadership has brought us to this point. He's getting it over the finish line. I encourage all of you to talk about that a little bit back home with a constituency that doesn't believe we can do anything here together, doesn't believe there's any compromise, doesn't believe there's a leadership to get it over. Sitting right in front of us, and you have it today. So with that, I encourage all of you to support this piece of legislation.
I thank the gentleman for his comments and his support. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Mr. Takano, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to associate myself with the remarks already made on both sides of the aisle this morning. The Blue Water Navy Veterans Act is long overdue and helps remedy a past wrong. I'm proud that this committee was able to once again reach a bipartisan agreement to move forward with this legislation that does what's right for our nation's veterans. Passage of this legislation would extend eligibility to 90,000 veterans who served in Vietnam and who may have been exposed to Agent Orange. Now, exposure to this dangerous herbicide can cause cancer, Parkinson's disease, heart disease, and many other conditions. And while ground troops in Vietnam have long been presumed to be exposed to Agent Orange, sailors offshore were not. And despite likely exposure through contaminated water or aerial spraying, these service members were not under this presumption to have been exposed to Agent Orange. With the passage of this bill, these blue water veterans will be eligible for the benefits they have long been owed. So I want to congratulate Chairman Rowe and Ranking Member Walls for their tremendous leadership on this issue, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Bilrakis, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I want to thank you for your leadership and your persistence on this particular issue. It's so very important. Great injustice was done for so many years for these veterans, and you're going to correct that with this particular bill, and I appreciate it so very much. Almost all of us on this committee believe this is long overdue, and these veterans should not be waiting any longer. I'm grateful for your leadership. I know this was a priority of yours, and the ranking members, my good friend, Mr. Walsh. Again, your continued commitment to finding a common sense solution for these great heroes, our Blue Water Navy veterans. You never gave up, and I appreciate that. I believe the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute is a bipartisan compromise that strikes the right balance between ensuring that we can adequately pay for the 90,000 veterans without negatively impacting other programs that our heroes rely on. The temporary loan funding fee increase is rolled into the life of the loan and does not, I want to repeat that, and does not apply to any veteran who has a disability, all while providing equity to reservist rates. We all of us on this committee have an obligation to honor our nation's heroes as we do for their sacrifice and ensure the men and women who dedicated their lives to serving our nation are receiving the compensation they deserve. So let's hope that the Senate picks up this bill as soon as possible and the President signs it so we can make our heroes whole. Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Since no other amendments were timed in a timely fashion, filed in a timely fashion, the question now occurs on my amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 299. All those in favor of my amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 299 say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. My amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 299 is agreed to. I now recognize Ranking Member Walsh for a motion to report H.R. 299 as amended.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 299 as amended be reported favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 299 as amended is reported favorably to the full House. Before we move on, I want to thank a couple of people on H.R. 299. I want to thank both the staff on the majority and the minority side for never stopping to look for a pay-for. That's what has held us up for 30 years. And I want to thank the VSOs for their doggedness and working with us and getting this across the finish line, because without your help, it wouldn't have happened. So that's where really the credit goes, is to the staff who worked, both minority and majority staffs, and the VSOs who kept pushing. And we're going to see the President sign this long-awaited bill, 30 years to get this done. So thank you. I now call up H.R. 5674, the VA Mission Act of 2018. The clerk shall report.
H.R. 5674 to establish a permanent community care program for veterans.
The bill was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules without objection. The first reading is dispensed with. H.R. 5674 is a bipartisan, bicameral agreement that has been negotiated over the last several weeks among me, Chairman Isaacson, Ranking Member Tester of the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, and Ranking Member Walls. This agreement contains several legislative priorities held by this committee, Republicans and Democrats alike, as well as our Veterans Service Organization partners and the Department of Veterans Affairs and the administration. This compromise is one that we can all be extraordinarily proud to support. It includes language we have worked on throughout the 115th Congress to, one, consolidate VA's 7 community care programs, including choice, into one streamlined program that improves veterans' access to timely, quality care in the community while preserving VA's function as the primary coordinator of veterans' care. Provide sufficient funding to keep the choice program alive and working for veterans over the next year as VA works to implement the new consolidated community care program. It'll take them about that long to implement this, they've told us. To create a transparent, objective process to recommend changes to realign and strengthen VA's crumbling medical infrastructure to ensure VA remains strong and able to provide the very best care for generations of veterans to come. And lastly, to expand VA's program of comprehensive assistance to family caregivers to create parity for all generations of veterans and their caregivers. Again, to right a disparity in the law right now where we treat one group of veterans who served after a certain date different than a group of veterans who served prior to that date. Improving VA's internal capacity to care for veteran patients through numerous provisions that would make VA a stronger, more efficient healthcare system and reinforce VA's ability to recruit, retain, and train highly qualified clinicians. With over 18 months of hearings, meetings, roundtables, and regular order on these provisions, I'm proud to be here as we vote to advance this vital legislation to the full House. I want to thank Senators Isaacson and Tester for exhibiting tremendous leadership on the north side of the Capitol, and for a representative that's difficult to brag on a senator. I want to tell you how hard that is to do. Without their willingness to work together to overcome our differences, this bipartisan, bicameral bill would never have become a reality. I could spend all morning talking about how passing H.R. 5674 this morning is the right thing to do for veterans. Instead, I will quote a letter we received yesterday from 38 military and veteran service organizations that called H.R. 5674, quotes, a historic opportunity to improve the lives of veterans, their families, and caregivers, end quotes. I wholeheartedly agree with them and urge every committee member to do their part by voting in support of this bill today. Before the bill is up for amendment, I'd like to reiterate in the strongest possible terms that H.R. 5674 is a result of months of careful negotiations between me, Senators Isaacson and Tester, and Ranking Member Walz. Given that, it's a little bit frustrating, at the very least, that the amendments, 3 of these that have the ranking member were filed yesterday, filed to this bill yesterday. Any amendments to the bill, no matter how wordy they may be, violate the terms of our negotiations and put us right back to square one just about 3 weeks before the choice programs run out of money. So the 1st of June, that's 3 weeks from now, we have no money in the choice program, and there are veterans all across the nation that will have nowhere or either get back in a long line like they did in Phoenix now 4 years ago. Yesterday, Acting Secretary Wilkie sent a letter stating that funds remaining in the choice account would be exhausted as early as May 31st, which would, quote, have dramatic negative impact on our veteran population, end quote. According to that letter, if we do not act today and get H.R. 5674 on the path to the President's desk by Memorial Day, our nation's veterans will face very real, very serious consequences. Consequences that will be on our hands if we fail to act today. Those consequences include increased waiting times, decreased access to needed services, and disrupted continuity of care. What's more, VA relationships with community partners, relationships that VA needs to provide the level of care that veterans require, could be damaged. The time for negotiations has come and gone, and I assure you that Ranking Member Walz was afforded every opportunity to be active and was in these negotiations. He's involved in all the meetings regarding this bill and was given the same opportunities as Senator Isaacson and Tester were and I had over the last many weeks. And this is a compromise agreement. I can assure you that this is not where we started 1 year ago. And none of us sitting at this dais or in the Senate got everything we wanted. And I think when I believe I worked in good faith with Ranking Member Walls to change the AIR Act provisions at Senator Isaacson and Tester. We all did that, and we were able to come to an agreement on that request, which is reflected in the text of the bill. And then the only changes that the ranking member advocated for until last Wednesday night were, before the bill was introduced, was the staff asked for 3 significant changes made to the community care portion of the bill to appease the unions, it appears. And we have worked on that issue, but we made changes we could in exchange for that. Those changes, the minority would not submit any amendments to H.R. 5674 at this markup if there were. Though this was the first time that these concerns had been raised and requested changes were significant. My staff and I worked again in good faith into the weekend to see what we could do. We did try. Unfortunately, the VA informed us that the changes requested by the union would have been overly burdensome on VA employees, so they could not support that part of the bill. They support the bill, just not that provision, those provisions of it. Perhaps if those changes had been floated earlier in our negotiation, we would have been able to come to some workable solution. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. We have an opportunity now today to do something, I think, transformational for the VA. I think this is truly a once-in-a-lifetime transformational bill. We have an opportunity to use the best of the VA to get the best care for our veterans in the community care bill by still having the VA as their primary director of care. Number 2, we have a chance to right a wrong, to treat all veterans the same. How can I look at a veteran my age who has been catastrophically wounded in combat and treat them differently than somebody who was wounded after 9/11, or a World War II veteran like Senator Bob Dole, who was catastrophically injured during World War II? And lastly, we need to put the VA infrastructure is decades old, and we need to put the VA on a path of a more modern healthcare system. And this bill amazingly does that, plus funds the choice program for the next year while the VA has time to implement the new community care program. So it is a really good bill. And is it everything I want? No. Would I have had things differently in here? Yes, I would have if I had been the sole writer. But we did this so that we could get a four corners agreement and get this to the President's desk and get this uncertainty done away with. With that said, I will now open the bill for amendment. Who seeks recognition on offering amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to H.R. 5674.
The clerk shall report.
Amendment to H.R. 5674, offered by Mr. Walls of Minnesota, page 228, after line 3, insert the following.
Yes, consent that further reading of the amendment be dispensed with. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I now recognize Ranking Member Walls for 5 minutes to discuss his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I first ask for unanimous consent to strike the last sentence of the amendment.
Thank you. So ordered. Without objection, so ordered.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do want to be clear. The Chairman's words were correct. His frustrations are justified. Regular order was followed. A fairness in the agreement was done. It was accorded to us. There was ample give and take on this. And when I went to bed Saturday night, we had a four corners agreement that I believe would satisfy everything we needed. We were starting to move forward. The White House objected. Our frustrations lie many times with the chaos. I don't know who to talk to up there. I don't know who's really in charge of the VA now with a acting secretary. And again, this has nothing to do with what the chairman did. It has nothing to do with what he agreed to. It has nothing to do with the 95% of the bill that he's exactly right we're in total agreement on. It has to do with the continuity and how we get things in place to continue forward. So as I said, the chairman's frustrations, I hear him. They are justified. For all of you, the process and the regular order were followed all the way until we got to a point, and the chairman's job is to get something to the President that the President can sign. I fully understand that. It's my responsibility to continue to make the case that all of the pieces have to be aligned to make this work in the long run. And this amendment, what I'd like to do is just to explain it briefly to you, let you get the opportunity to see if this is something that makes sense, understanding that the chairman's ability to move a lot of pieces together to get something done is complex. The bill does move the current choice funding account from mandatory spending to discretionary spending. That is the right thing to do. That's what we've agreed on. However, this bill fails to address how VA will be able to fund all of its programs once the transfer occurs. Our current budget caps do not allow for this level of spending without triggering automatic across-the-board cuts under sequestration when the legislation goes into effect next year. My amendment would hold us harmless for exceeding those budget caps and would keep the bipartisan deal in place. Without taking this action, and you will all be here to witness this come next June, jeopardize the long-term health and stability of VA health care provided in the hospitals as well as in the community. For this reason, I urge the adoption of my amendment. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, but I will not be supporting this amendment. And in February 9th, we voted for a bipartisan budget act. And that law increased discretionary cap space by $63 billion in FY 2018 and $68 billion in FY 2019 for non-defense spending, which includes the VA. To this point, we've funded the Choice Program with a mandatory unoffset appropriation. The Missions Act contains another $5.2 billion for the Choice Program, but got us to will get us to May of 2019 when the new community care program will go live. At that point, funding community care program will be entirely discretionary. It will be the appropriator's job to fund the program going forward under the existing cap agreement we voted on in February and any new cap agreement for 2020 and beyond. And any conversations regarding appropriations caps are outside the jurisdiction. That's a Ways and Means Committee discussion. And what's more, the conversations are completely irrelevant to the one we're having today. Congress has and always will find the funding necessary to pay for health care for our veterans. Even during the historic period of austerity in the recent years, the Congress has never hesitated to invest in VA. Let me just give you an example. We voted for the Budget Control Act in 2011, August of 2011, which held discretionary spending almost exactly equal. In other words, we spent almost exactly the same in 2018 as we did in 2011, and yet VA spending went up by tens of billions of dollars. We took that money from somewhere else and funded our veterans. So I think this amendment is a red herring, and I think, again, I will not support it. Any members wish to comment? Anybody else? Mr. Connell, you recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with the comments of Ranking Member Walz and the need for this amendment. Now, I'm very proud of the bipartisan nature of this committee, and in the last year and a half, we've come together to pass critical legislation that supports our nation's veterans, like the Forever GI Bill, and taking important steps to fight the VA's appeals backlog. And in that spirit, I think we can all agree that community care, will be a part of the spectrum of care that veterans receive now and in the future. In fact, community care has always been a part of VA health care. We also agree that the status quo is confusing and failing veterans and providers alike. Consolidating and streamlining the ways veterans access non-VA care is absolutely essential, and that's what this bill does do. But we must ensure that we do it in a sustainable way. The cost associated with the expanding reliance on community care should concern everyone on this committee. Thus far, our commitment to filling funding gaps in veterans' health care has been unconditional. However, as costs continue to rise and as mounting deficits put pressure on the federal budget, we must consider the long-term sustainability of these programs. I reiterate that, the long-term sustainability of these programs. And while previous funding for choice came from emergency mandatory funding, moving forward, the program will receive discretionary funding and could break caps that trigger sequestration. And I do agree with the chairman, they'll find the money, but it's where they'll find the money. We will be in a situation where serving our veterans will be pitted against other budget priorities in the non-discretionary part of the budget, of the discretionary part of the budget, including it could pit veterans against defense. Sequestration included automatic cuts to both defense and the non-defense sides of the budget. What Mr. Wallace's amendment ensures is that funding authorized in this bill does not break the sequestration caps. It helps guarantee that we continue to keep our promises to veterans by funding the full range of supports and benefits that they're owed, the full range of them. Without this critical amendment, I'm concerned that we'll be facing difficult choices, and I fear that veterans will ultimately pay the price, and I mean that in the literal sense. Choice. Not only do budget caps make it difficult for the VA to request and receive necessary resources to serve veterans, but triggering sequestration cuts will undermine funding for programs that support veterans across the federal government. Programs like DOL Vets, which provides employment resources and helps veterans transition to meaningful civilian careers. Now, sequestration is a technical term that the general public may have may struggle to understand. But in the end, what sequestration means is that it is across-the-board cuts that will harm all Americans. It means reduced investment in education, delayed repairs to roads and bridges, and possibly harm to our military readiness. I once again ask my colleagues to find that spirit of bipartisanship and support Mr. Walz's amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. And the sequester only occurs if we breach the caps, and that'll be the appropriators that will make that decision. And I can assure you, I know from this sitting in this chair right here on the dais that I've never apologized, and I've told my constituents this, for three things that I'll spend money on. One is defense of this nation. That's number one. I want the men and women that serve this nation to have whatever they need, and I'm going to vote. I just did it about 6 weeks ago. Number two, I'm never going to apologize for spending money on nation's veterans when they come home and get served. I will not do that. Number three, I'm going to support our farmers because I like to eat, and I want the food grown in this country. So those are three things I will not apologize for spending money on, nor has this Congress, by the way, done that. Anyone else wish to comment on the amendment? Hearing no others, the question now occurs on Ranking Member Wall's First Amendment to H.R. 5674. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The Ranking Member's First Amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Is there a sufficient second? Second, there is being a sufficient second, the question now occurs on Ranking Member Wall's Amendment Number 1 to H.R. 5674. The clerk shall call the roll.
This is the financial bill.
Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Bilirakis? Mr. Kaufman? Mr. Winstrip? Mr. Bost? Mr. Poliquin? Mr. Dunn? Mr. Arrington? Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Bergman? Mr. Banks? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Mr. Walz?
Aye.
Mr. Takano?
Aye.
Ms. Brownlee? Mr. O'Rourke? Ms. Rice? Mr. Correa? Mr. Lamb? Mr. Peters? Yes. Mr. Chairman, the votes are 8 ayes, 13 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Who else seeks recognition for the purpose of offering an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk shall report.
Amendment to H.R. 5674, offered by Mr. Walz of Minnesota, page 14, line 15.
I ask unanimous consent that further reading of the amendment be dispensed with. Hearing no objection, so ordered. And I recognize Ranking Member Walz for 5 minutes to discuss his third amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment makes 3 tweaks to the community care eligibility part of the bill. And again, I want to be absolutely clear, the good faith effort, the staff on both sides, the majority staff especially, took these from the minority staff, incorporated them into the bill. They were rejected by the White House and subsequently pulled out. So as far as how this committee works, the effort and the ability for us to get them in, this was in the original piece that went up to the White House on Saturday morning. They came back without them in. So I think it's important for all of us to realize and to acknowledge that we work together on it. It simply does this, just a couple for you folks who did not see it. Amendment will require VA to review its decision to authorize a veteran to receive care in the community after 1 year. It means the VA would still remain engaged in managing the veteran's care and working with veterans to determine if the veteran will receive better care from a VA provider or better care in the community. This is simply an oversight responsibility because the last time we did this down in Atlanta, we lost track of a lot of people and they received substandard care. There is no guarantee that they will receive better care or worse care. I understand that. If you have the assumption they're going to receive better care, that's fine. Why would we not validate it? Why would we not bring it in and make sure that we've not moved a veteran out, then it's out of sight, out of mind, no longer our responsibility, they're in the community care. This simply asks us to review that, bring it back, take a look at it again. We'll see if that is something we could engage in. It requires the same review after 6 months for facilities with underperforming service lines. So the VA is forced to either hire staff or address infrastructure needs in facilities that cannot meet VA's care to access to standard. And then it deals with how we view emergency or urgent care and the number of providers, making sure that we're not getting a continuous line of people going to urgent care without getting the holistic care that they get at the VA, and we're getting a veteran that is not getting that care to improve, but they're simply going one after the other to urgent care instead of coming back and looking and assessing holistically. I simply say I thank the chairman. These things were agreed to. They were in the original bill. They were accepted at that time up until Saturday morning. And someone at the White House who I do not know, have never seen and never talked to, said no. That's their prerogative. That's the constitutional way. I just simply think if we could ask, we could put these things back in there to help us get this done.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The provisions, just to be clear, were never in the bill. We agreed to make a good faith effort to see if all parties could agree. And the administration, all levels, OMB, VA opposed, and therefore we will have to oppose this.
That is correct. I'm sorry if I misspoke on that. The chairman is right. That's correct. It was our proposal. The chairman allowed them to see it. It never went that far. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? Okay, seeing no one, let's see, where are we here? Yeah. I will not be supporting this. The amendment contains the language that had been requested by the unions on last Wednesday evening for the first time, and I did work in a good faith, as the ranking member said, to incorporate. According to VA, the language in this amendment would create an unworkable, unnecessary burden on VA employees. And back to one other comment that we're trying to do for veterans is, again, and I think that's everyone on this dais wants to do this, is that we want veterans to get the absolute best care they can get. In the community care bill, it allows a veteran to go to a walk-in clinic at no charge. And if you got a cold or something on a Sunday afternoon and you may be a long wait, you can go get care somewhere on an acute care basis. If you want to go to the VA, you can do that too. It just gives you the opportunity to do that. The VA's problem with this would require constantly reviewing whether the veterans are eligible to receive care in the community, and the VA's that's already been referred for that. And just remember that 38 military and veteran service organizations believe in no uncertain terms in this bill that it's the right thing to do for veterans. Any further comments from anyone? Now, hearing none, the question now occurs on Ranking Member Wall's third amendment to H.R. 5674. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the nays have it. The ranking member's third amendment to
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded
A
vote.
recorded vote has been requested. Is there sufficient second? Second. Having been a sufficient second, the question now occurs on Ranking Member Wall's amendment number 3 to H.R. 5674. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Chairman? No. Mr. Bilirakis? Mr. Kaufman? Dr. Wenstrup? Ms. Radewagen? Mr. Bost? Mr. Poliquin? Dr. Dunn? Mr. Arrington? Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Bergman? Mr. Banks? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Radewagen? Mr. Walls? Mr. Takano? Ms. Brownlee? Ms. Custer? Mr. O'Rourke? Ms. Rice? Mr. Correa? Mr. Lamb? Ms. Esty? Mr. Peters? Mr. Chairman, the vote is 8 ayes, 13 noes.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment. That's to H.R. 5674. That's all right.
An amendment to H.R. 5674 offered by Mr. O'Rourke of Texas at the end of Title.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to begin by thanking you and the ranking member, the minority and the majority staff, the veteran service organizations, and our colleagues for the work on this bill. And I was just talking to a group who was up from Waco and College Station in Bryan, Texas yesterday, and there was some talk about the swamp in Washington, D.C., and I said, really, this is the high ground here. It's the last bastion of bipartisanship. We don't see these issues based on party. We're all trying to do our best for our service members, our military retirees, and our veterans. And I'm grateful for all the work that each of you have put in, and by extension, your teams. And so grateful for that. And this amendment really just seeks to address an issue that each of us has raised and tried to make better, which is that we don't have enough providers in the VA today. By the VA's own admission, we're somewhere between 30 and 40,000 clinical positions authorized, funded, waiting for the right person who is not there yet. And it means that veterans are going without the ability to see a provider, a specialist, at a time of 20 veterans a day taking their own lives without being able to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a therapist. The Education Debt Reduction Program is one of the ways by which we can seek to recruit and retain more of these providers and more of these positions. Right now, the way that this program works, it is up to the Secretary as to whether the recipient is reimbursed annually or monthly. And if you're carrying tens of thousands of dollars annually in student debt payments that you're making, the ability to receive that reimbursement monthly might make the VA a more attractive option. If you have to wait until the end of the year after you spent, $30,000, $40,000 to get reimbursed, that might be a harder burden to carry. So, Mr. Chairman, this just allows the recipient, the beneficiary, that provider within the VA to elect to receive monthly reimbursements instead of waiting for an annual reimbursement. Again, I think this will help the VA become the employer of choice for those providers that we desperately need right now, and would seek your and the committee's support on this issue. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Does anyone else wish to speak on Mr. O'Rourke's amendment? Anybody else? I did not see anyone. I will not be supporting this amendment. That said, my opposition is without prejudice. I was pleased to include Representative O'Rourke's legislation concerning the Education Debt Reduction Program in the underlying bill. And I wish that the ranking member had come forward and suggested the language in this amendment during our negotiations. I would have been glad to consider it. However, once again, this is a carefully negotiated bipartisan bicameral bill, and the time for further negotiations has passed. Do any other members wish to comment? Hearing none, the question now occurs on Representative O'Rourke's amendment to H.R. 5674. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it. Representative O'Rourke's amendment to H.R. 5674 is not agreed to. Who seeks recognition for the purpose of offering an amendment? Ms. Brownlee, you're recognized. The clerk shall report.
Amendment to H.R. 5674, offered by Ms. Brownlee of
Ask
California.
unanimous consent that further reading of the amendment be dispensed with. Hearing no objection, so ordered. And now recognize Representative Brownlee for 5 minutes to discuss her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And based on your opening comments regarding the careful negotiations of this bill and not accepting any amendments, I will say that I will withdraw all 3 of my amendments. I would like to make a few statements before the withdrawal. And so first, with regards to the choice bill and the language and regarding the barriers faced in choice, traffic is a big, big issue, and it's a big issue in my district for my veterans to travel to the West LA facility that takes them literally all day long to get there and to return home, usually starting at 6 or so in the morning and getting back.
I've been on the 405.
Yes, okay, so you have an understanding of that. And so it's been my desire all along to make traffic more explicit in the bill as an area that would be clear that if traffic is the barrier, then you do have the option to select care in the community. So I understand you're not accepting any more amendments now, but as we move forward on this, and if there is an opening anywhere, if we could possibly discuss being more explicit about traffic, I would be greatly, greatly appreciative. Second, the next 2 amendments could either be laid into this bill or could be passed certainly as standalone independent bills. And one is certainly, and this committee has talked a lot about parity in the health care for women, and child care is a very important element to that. It's not exclusive to women in terms of child care, but we do know that the preponderance of women who do have children and need child care to go and seek their health care. So this is something that we have discussed on this committee and certainly can move forward on a standalone basis, and I would appreciate your help and support on that. And lastly, again, in terms of parity for women, the mental health of our women veterans, and it has been clear and proven that these retreat-type settings where women get together has been very, very effective, and certainly what this amendment and what my previous bill did was to say, let's open this up, across the country so what we believe to be a good practice and a best practice can be implemented throughout the country. So again, this could be a freestanding, standalone bill, and would appreciate your help in moving forward. But in light of your careful negotiations, I will, at this moment, withdraw those 3 amendments in hoping that you will help and support as we move forward.
I thank the gentlelady for withdrawing, and I certainly will. I think the distance, whether you're stuck on the 405 or whether you have to drive 3 hours in Wyoming, is still 3 hours, and then to get there and find out your appointment's been canceled and you got to get back on the 405. So I totally understand that. The other 2 bills that you mentioned certainly could be standalones, and I'd be more than happy to work with you. It's just not the vehicle right here to do that, but certainly we will work with you on that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too, when the time is appropriate, would like to speak to the underlying bill. Okay. And with that, I yield back.
Who seeks recognition for the purpose of offering an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
The gentleman has an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk shall report.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5674, offered by Mr. Walls of Minnesota.
Ask unanimous consent that further reading of the amendment in the nature of a substitute be dispensed with. Hearing no objection, so ordered. And now recognize Ranking Member Walls for 5 minutes to discuss his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment in the nature of a substitute for the Mission Act would empower VA to provide the health care veterans need in the setting that we already know veterans prefer, VA medical facilities. This ANS consolidates current community care programs in an easy-to-navigate manner that is is highly transparent to both Congress and the veteran community. The straightforward eligibility standards in the ANS were adopted from H.R. 4242, the Chairman's original choice replacement bill. And I believe these eligibility standards are the closest to what Congress and the stakeholders originally expected when we started negotiations. This ANS would also fully expand the VA's caregiver support program to veterans of all areas of expansion that's long overdue. Lastly, to ensure VA continues to be there to care for future generations of veterans, our sons, daughters, and grandchildren, this ANS would create a process for asset review that not only allows VA to reduce the burden of unused facilities on taxpayers, but also preserves VA's current footprint while doing so. This would allow VA more flexibility in leasing, accepting, and sharing resources with fellow agencies and the private sector. Mr. Chairman, I know you're aware asset review is a nuanced issue. While I appreciate the hard work the staff has put into realigning the BRAC-style process so that may apply to VA, I believe VA is unique in the services it provides because of the population it serves. Therefore, we should look at VA assets differently from the way we look at DoD assets. They are inherently different. My ANS does just that. It looks at a unique system and proposes a thorough and responsible solution, not one copy and pasted from another agency. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to give this proposed solution their support. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I will not be supporting this amendment in the nature of a substitute and admit to finding myself a bit puzzled. The amendment in the nature of a substitute contains almost verbatim the entire community care portion of H.R. 4242 as amended, which the ranking member voted against in December. And just to let you talk about the asset review for a minute, I was the Commission on Care made this recommendation. I've traveled from Long Island to Los Angeles, Puerto Rico, and all places in between in the last 17 months. And I'm going to give you a poster child for why we have to do this. We've spent $2 billion on a hospital that's 1.2 billion over budget in Denver, Colorado. A beautiful facility. Mr. Kaufman and I were out there along with others just a few months ago. It's 1,100 feet long. I mean, it is 3.5 football fields long. It has less than half the primary care teams that the old hospital has. So now we've set up a situation where you have to have a new hospital that's going to be very expensive to run, and an old hospital you can't close. And in 1981, hospitalizations peaked in America. In other words, the number of people actually in a hospital peaked 37 years ago. We have 40% more people in the country than we had in 1981, and yet we have 10% less people this last year actually hospitalized. I then went about a month ago to Fayetteville, North Carolina, and visited down there. Had a field hearing in Fayetteville. They have a CBOC, an outpatient clinic, that has a diagnostic center. It's easy to get in and out of. They have an outpatient surgery, diagnostic center, and 39 primary care teams, twice what this $2 billion structure in Denver does. That's why we have to align these, because more and more and more care is occurring in the community. And I'll give you an example. I'm an old doctor. I've been around a long time, since just after penicillin was invented. And I can tell you, I have no idea what kind of care you're going to be able to get in your home in 20 years with this right here, this device right here. You may do 80% of your care from your living room in the future. And that's why we have to align the VA in this modern system. And by the way, I will give the VA a big shout out. They are a leader in telehealth in the country. And they're on the cutting edge of telehealth. And that's one of the reasons we've got to get it right-sized, to get the care to the veteran, not to maintaining these old structures. Over 1,000 buildings being maintained that we could use for health care or disability benefits. So I have said enough. Does any other member wish to comment on this bill? Mr. Cray, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This realignment is a personal issue to me, and I'll tell you why. I come from Orange County, and about a dozen years ago, we closed down the El Toro military air base after the federal government invested over $1 billion in improvements. 12 months later under BRAC, it was closed down. It's gone. To me, it was a very personal issue because a lot of the veterans in my area had served at El Toro, and number two is, in my opinion, strategically a base we should have kept. But thinking about the lessons learned from that BRAC system, and thinking about what we're doing here in terms of our veteran facilities, VA facilities, trying to project out where the services are going to be needed in 20 years is a difficult job. And as I look at areas like Mr. Takano's area, Riverside area, Inland Empire, areas that are the fastest growing in the U.S., knowing that the veterans are going out there to live, and thinking about selling those assets off today, realigning our resources, our federal government resources in that area, concerns me, because in 20 years, we may end up having to buy some of those properties back in order to take care of our veterans. I agree with you. There's a lot of waste, a lot of mismanagement, and those are issues that, Mr. Chairman, we do have to address. And as I've said before in this committee, I think this is an issue we have to address very carefully. Thank you, sir. I yield the remainder of my time.
I think you actually made my point. The demographics of the country, you're absolutely correct. People are moving from the northeast to the south and west. There's no question that demographic change. And what's happened to us is as that demographic is changing, it leaves these empty structures. And one of the things I know that Ms. Custer talks about, Ms. Brownlee, all the time, and they're absolutely right, is for instance, if there's tremendous growth there, if you have a facility leased in 20 years, you may be right. They may need another facility, another community clinic. And another thing the VA has done very well are put community-based clinics where put the care near where the veteran is. Don't make them drive hours down the 405 and stuck in traffic when they could be home, but bring the care to where they are. And that's one of the things we're doing. This bill actually may have more facilities instead of less. We may find out we need 3 CBOCs in his district where there are none now. That's the idea of an asset. Put the assets where the patients are, and that's changing. And when VA builds these big structures, they can't be moved. You can't get out of them. Then you're stuck with them. And, I mean, I have a VA in my hometown that's built it wasn't a VA, it was an old soldier's home. It was opened in 1903. It's 115 years ago. Well, healthcare looks a little different than it did for a post-Civil War veteran. And so that's what we're trying to do is modernize this, make the VA more nimble in its ability. It may, in some areas, it may be building more structures, and very well may likely be that. Dr. Winstrup.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you know, I understand what you're saying, Mr. Correa, and I respect that. I don't look at this like a BRAC. I really think that we're going to take logical approaches to things. And you know, we don't know what things are going to look like 20 years from now, but we do know what they looked like 30 years ago, and they don't look like that today. So I don't want to be stuck in what was 30 years ago. And I look at it as we got to look at what we have, what we don't have, what we need, and what we don't need. And Dr. Rowe touched on the CBOCs, which in my opinion have been tremendously successful and much greater opportunity for primary care. But also think about the doctors that you try to hire. They don't want to make that trip either down to the VA through all that traffic if they live out in that area. They would like to go to a local place. So those are the types of opportunities that I think we need to look at. It's all about getting care to the veterans, but your words of caution are received in this case, and I yield back.
Mr. Takano.
Yeah, well, so, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Ranking Member Walls for offering his amendment in the nature of a substitute. It does include provisions that are very similar to those in the underlying bill that have bipartisan support, like the expansion of the caregiver program to all veterans of all eras. I mean, there's without a question that is something that is bipartisan support on this committee, and the language is near identical. And you know, by supporting this amendment, I'm indicating my support for caregivers. I believe it strikes, but I do believe that it strikes a better balance between investing in the VA's internal capacity and providing timely access to care in the community when it's the best option for our veterans. So I believe Mr. Walls' amendment, ANS, strikes a better balance between those two, those two things. Additionally, the substitute amendment includes key provisions that strengthen our investment in the VA's workforce and internal capacity. It continues to expand and improve graduate medical education at the VA, and calls for investing in proper staffing across the department, and it requires the VA to develop a plan to address the problem of underserved facilities, and includes multiple loan repayment and debt reduction opportunities for dedicated workers who serve veterans. Now, the ranking member's amendment also includes an improved asset realignment language. That's what we're talking about now, the air portion of this bill. It would create a process for asset review that not only allows VA to reduce the burden of unused facilities on taxpayers, and that's what you were talking about, and we're all concerned about that, so the amendment does contain language that addresses this issue. But it also preserves VA's current footprint while doing so, to provide the continuity of care and services. That's a huge concern of ours. The amendment would also allow VA more flexibility when it comes to leasing facilities. You know, we were talking about these C-blocks. So Mr. Walls' amendment would allow greater flexibility for these leasing of facilities. So, so the VA can accept and share resources with fellow agencies and the private sector. That's a tremendous need that we have in our rural and urbanizing areas, outer areas that are far away from, like, the LA VA. So I think Mr. Walls' amendment has language that's better overall for the things we were talking about here, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Do any other members wish to comment? Hearing none, the question now occurs on Ranking Member Walls' amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5674. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the nays have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Is there a sufficient second?
I second.
There being a sufficient second, the question now occurs on Ranking Member Walls' amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5674. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Bilrakis? Mr. Kaufman? Dr. Wenstrup? Ms. Radwagen? Mr. Bost? Mr. Poliquin? Dr. Dunn? Mr. Arrington? Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Bergman? Mr. Banks? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Mr. Walls?
Aye.
Mr. Takano? Ms. Brownlee? Ms. Custer? Mr. O'Rourke? Ms. Rice? Mr. Correa? Mr. Lamb? Ms. Esty? Mr. Peters? Mr. Chairman, the vote is 8 yeas and 14 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Do any members wish to comment further on H.R. 5674? Ms. Brownlee, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as many of my colleagues have already done, I also want to thank you and all the leadership, the ranking member as well, the leadership around negotiating this very, very important bill. And I really do appreciate all the effort that has gone into it. I wish that we could include Mr. Walsh's language into this bill because I think it would improve upon it, but I understand the conditions. But I do want to say that, it has been the mission of this committee from the very beginning is to consolidate the community care programs into one single program that's easy for veterans to use and for community providers to participate in. We need to, as I've said, many of us have said many times on this committee, we, at the same time and simultaneous to that consolidation, we need to invest in the VA and make the VA better. And we need to find that right balance. And I think we are pretty close to finding that balance. And in this bill, I don't I don't really see an explicit expansion of the community care program, but a leaner, more consolidated simplification of the varied community care programs that already exist today. I also recognize the concerns of my colleagues about the effect this bill will have on discretionary caps and the issue that we'll need to address, and it is a valid issue that we will need to address in fiscal year 2020. And imposing these caps would be devastating, really devastating for all VA programs and every other discretionary program. But I also believe that it's a that would be a systemic problem across all agencies, and that we will have to address that. And I have not seen a trend of pitting veteran issues against other programs in terms of moving forward. And I would hope when we get to that point, we will continue to keep veteran issues very much in the forefront. On the asset review piece, I think I've tried to be very, very clear on this, that that I have concerns that this is perhaps not the way to build the 21st century VA. We definitely need to realign older facilities and so forth, but I just simply think that we should have a more sort of beefed up skip and be doing this on a continuous basis. I think we're already well aware that there is low-hanging fruit out there, and I think that we should be able to take advantage of that immediately, as opposed to waiting 5 or 6 years to look at the entire landscape. And I just think that that's a better way to address it. But there have been changes in the language in the bill that have been made that improve upon the asset review, and we had a full discussion here in the committee. The caregiver expansion, I think, is going to be truly transformative. When I saw this in the language, I can't tell you how happy it made me, and I know that this is an area that you have compromised on because you had offered alternative ways in which to get there for our pre- and post 9/11 veterans. So I thank you for that. And the telehealth language in the bill, I think, is very strong in your statements that you said in terms of the future. So I think on balance there are enough pieces in this bill to help veterans and to help their families. I'm going to be voting to move this compromise forward to the floor, and I'm committed to making further refinements if there are opportunities and improvements as the new program is implemented. And just let me conclude on one final thought, and that is community care, as has been stated, has always been a part of the VA, but it cannot and will not will replace essential care from the VA. And I think we just need to be, utterly clear about that, and I think we're going to need to create legislation that stands with this piece of legislation to ensure to all of our veterans that that is not our intention, but is our intention to continue while consolidating this program and providing the option of community care. It is also our intention to modernize and expand the VA where we need to, and in terms of what you've been talking about, where the veterans are, and the improvement on leasing options that the ranking member proposed, I certainly support. I have a bill to make it easier to lease VA facilities that I hope this committee will revisit. But on balance, I again thank you for your negotiations, and I'll be supporting the bill. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I
thank the
yield back.
gentlelady for her comments and her support of the bill, and I truly mean that. We began 15 months ago working through this process. It seems awfully slow, but sometimes slow is good. I know with the tortoise and the hare, sometimes the the tortoise wins the race. And we didn't write a perfect bill. I haven't seen a perfect bill be written yet. We wrote a piece of legislation that will need to be monitored, looked after, and changed, and that's what future committees, I think, will be doing, and there's no question in my mind we'll be doing that. And I think this is a monumental piece of legislation for the Veterans Affairs Committee. I don't remember, there's nothing in my 9.5 years here that even comes close to this, and how transformative it can be for the VA. Mr. Billrockis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief, but I just want to tell you that I appreciate what you're doing and what this committee is doing. We're doing extraordinary things for our veterans, and I want to put a plug in for our community health centers. I'm the co-chair of the Qualified Community Health Centers Caucus, and our veterans now, because of this bill, will have the choice to go to a community health center if they choose to go, and if they qualify for VA care, and I think that's a great thing. So particularly if you're in a rural area and you have a hard time getting to a clinic or a CBOC or a VA hospital, you can walk in and go to a community health center. They provide great care. So I think it's a wonderful thing, and there are some really good things for our veterans in this bill, and I'm very proud to support it. So in any case, I mean, I didn't get everything I wanted in this bill either. I had a provision that was left out in the final product, but I withheld and did not propose an amendment, but I plan to file a standalone bill, and hopefully it'll get a hearing. So in any case, I appreciate all the good work, and hopefully we get a bipartisan vote. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Anyone? Mr. Pollack, when you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I'd like to salute Ms. Brownlee for her forthcoming support for this bill, and I want to join her in this bipartisan fashion. This is a great piece of legislation, Mr. Chairman. I salute you and folks on the other side of the aisle that work so hard to get this done. I represent the rural part of Maine. Now, some people think that all of Maine is rural. Now, that's not true. But the 2nd District is highly, highly rural. And we have one medical facility, one VA hospital in Maine, Togus, we're very proud of. But, you know, there are a lot of folks, Mr. Chairman, that live 3, 4, 5 hours away from Togus. And when it's 2 in the morning and the snow's blowing sideways, you're not feeling well, it's really much better, much more convenient, and just common sense to be able to get your health care close to home. And I know that 38 of the veteran service organizations also support this compromise legislation. This is the House, the Senate, Republicans, Democrats. It's exactly what we should be doing here. One more thing I want to mention to everybody, and some of the other folks on the committee may have already seen this. If not, they may come into this. One of the problems we've had with the choice program that this bill helps fix is that our small local hospitals that are providing veteran services to our folks that live in their local areas are not getting paid, sometimes for 1 or 2 years. And so I've become a bill collector, Mr. Chairman, for our small rural hospitals in Maine, including paying a house call, unannounced house call to the folks over at HealthNet to make sure we made the point that it is critical that our small local hospitals get paid, not only for our veterans, but also it keeps our small rural hospitals open. So it helps everybody else in the community. So I'll be supporting this along with Ms. Brownlee, and I appreciate that very much. And I do hope we have a big bipartisan vote. And another thing I want to mention, Mr. Chairman, I know it's been said before, maybe not in this hearing, but it's critical to say, the choice program is not designed to replace the VA. That is not the goal. We have 66,000 veterans that we just adore in our 2nd District of Maine, and they heal better when they're with other veterans. We understand that. But sometimes it's just not practical for our veterans, as I said a moment ago, because they live so far away from a veterans facility. It's better to get their health care close at home. So this augments, this supplements the VA. It doesn't replace it. So I'm all in. I appreciate it very much. We've got to make sure our small rural hospitals get paid so they can stay open for our veterans and everybody else. And this is one of the things that this piece of legislation does, and I salute you for it, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. There are at least 2 square miles of Maine that are not rural. I would agree with that.
They're both in my backyard, sir. Thank you.
Having been in Maine and drove for 2 hours one night and didn't see a car.
And you loved every minute of it, Mr.
I loved
Chairman,
every
every single minute of it.
herniated disc. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support 5674. I'm a co-sponsor of the bill. However, I'd like to respectfully express reservations with the section of the bill. Section 105 of H.R. 5674 authorizes access to walk-in care for enrolled veterans who have used VA healthcare services in a 24-month period before seeking walk-in services. And although most Americans would clearly identify urgent care facilities as walk-in services, the VA does not clarify that within this bill. We would like to see clarification of urgent care facilities, and my office will be submitting a letter supporting that urgent care facilities be allowed streamlined access into the VA system, so that veterans in communities that are regularly, like most Americans, urgent care facilities have become part of the landscape and part of the cultural change of seeking community health care. And my review suggests that there's not very good clarification that urgent care facilities be included within the identifiers of walk-in services at the VA.
We will get you clarification of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's my intent, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Hearing none, and since no further amendments were timely filed, I yield to Representative Bilirakis for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that we favorably report H.R. 5674 to the full House.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no.
No.
Mr. Chairman, we ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested on H.R. 5674. Is there a sufficient second?
Yes, I
Second's been made. There being a sufficient second, the question now occurs on whether to report H.R. 5674 favorably to the House. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Bilirakis?
Yes.
Mr. Kaufman?
I'm a Southerner at heart.
Dr. Wenstrup?
Yes.
Ms. Redewagen? Yes. Mr. Bost? Mr. Poliquin? Dr. Dunn? Mr. Arrington? Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Bergman? Mr. Banks? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Mr. Walls? Mr. Takano? Ms. Brownlee? Ms. Custer? Mr. O'Rourke? Ms. Rice? Mr. Correa? Mr. Lamb? Ms. Esty? Mr. Peters? Mr. Bost? Ms. Esty? Ms. Custer? Mr. Chairman, the vote is 20 ayes and 2 noes.
The bill, H.R. 5674, is reported favorably to the House.
Mr. Chairman,
yes, sir.
Pursuant with House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I give notice of our intent to file minority, supplemental, additional, or dissenting views.
Without objection.
Thank you.
For all members' awareness, I want to bring this up for discussion. I'll be seeking to get a Four Corners agreement prior to this bill going to the floor to name the Mission Act after 2 American heroes, John McCain and Sam Johnson. These 2 men served 14 years as prisoners of war, and both are, as you know, are leaving the Congress this year. Sam Johnson I've told Sam this, and I truly mean this, that he's one of the privileges I've had serving here has been serving with Sam Johnson. What an amazing human being he is. And Senator McCain has served this country in public service for many years. So if any objection to that idea or any other comments about it, the chair would be willing to entertain that. Well, thank you all for that then. I'll now call up H.R. 1972, the VA Billing Accountability Act. Clerk shall report.
H.R. 1972 to amend Title 38 United States Code to authorize the Secretary of Veterans
Affairs. The bill was
Affairs.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill is now open for amendment at any point. Who seeks recognition for the purpose of offering an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Gentleman has an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk shall report.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1972 offered by Mr. Rutherford of Florida.
The further reading of Representative Rutherford's amendment in the nature of a substitute be dispensed with. Hearing no objection, so ordered. And I now recognize Mr. Rutherford for 5 minutes to discuss his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Chairman Rowe and Ranking Member Waltz, Committee, this amendment in the nature of a substitute is a straightforward change to H.R. 1972, the VA Billing Accountability Act. This bill, of which I am a co-sponsor, ensures that veterans are not penalized for errors or late notifications made by the VA when a veteran is required to make a copayment for medical services, medications, hospital care, or nursing home care. This substitute preserves everything in the base bill and extends the time by which the VA has to notify a veteran of a copay requirement from 120 days to 180 days. And this is in response to testimony from the VA and conforms with many other requirements set in the community care bill we are considering today and just passed. And so I thank you for your consideration on this amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Do any other members wish to comment? I will be supporting this amendment in the nature of a substitute. Hearing none, and since no other amendments were timely filed, the question now occurs on Representative Rutherford's amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1972. All those in favor of Mr. Rutherford's amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1972 say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I now recognize Ranking Member Walls for a motion to report H.R. 1972 as amended.
Mr. Chairman, I move H.R. 1972 as amended be reported favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor say aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 1972 as amended is reported favorably to the full House. I'll now call up H.R. 2147, the Veterans Treatment Court Improvement Act of 2017. The clerk shall report.
H.R. 2147 to require the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to hire additional Veterans Outreach
The bill
Specialists.
was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill is now open for amendment at any point. Who seeks recognition for the purpose of offering an amendment? Mr. Kaufman, you are recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk shall report.
An amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 2147.
Unanimous consent that further reading of Mr. Kaufman's amendment in the nature of a substitute be dispensed with. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I now recognize Mr. Kaufman for 5 minutes to discuss his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While many veterans successfully readjust and transition back to civilian life after their military service, unfortunately, some do not, often due to undiagnosed or untreated issues related to their service. Veterans find themselves involved in the criminal justice system. Veteran treatment courts were created to be dedicated to veteran offenders specifically. These specifically diversionary courts take veterans out of the regular criminal justice process to address the underlying issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder or substance abuse. The VA provides veteran justice outreach specialists who are licensed social workers operating through VA medical centers as part of the Veterans Justice Outreach Program. These veteran justice outreach specialists
link veterans to available VA services and treatment, and monitor the veterans' progress in the veterans treatment courts. Unfortunately, the VA has struggled to meet the demands for these critical Veterans Justice Outreach Specialists. My amendment, H.R. 2147, would reinforce the VA's responsibility to provide a sufficient number of Veterans Justice Outreach Specialists, VJOs, to meet the need for their services. The changes included in my amendment were based on discussions with the VA, Government Accountability Office, and the Congressional Budget Office to ensure our nation's veterans can avail themselves of the opportunity to enter the veterans treatment courts and succeed in rehabilitating themselves. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thanks, gentlemen, for yielding. I will be supporting this amendment in the nature of a substitute. Do any members wish to comment? Hearing none, since no other amendments were timely filed, the question now occurs on Mr. Kaufman's amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2147. All those in favor of Mr. Kaufman's amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2147 say aye. 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 All opposed say no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2147 is agreed to. I now recognize Ranking Member Walls for a motion to report H.R. 2147 as amended.
Mr. Chairman, I move H.R. 2147 as amended be reported favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor say aye. 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 All opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 2147 as amended is reported favorably to the full House. I now call up H.R. 3642, the Military Sexual Assault Victims Empowerment SAVE Act. Clerk shall report.
H.R. 3642, to direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to carry out a pilot program.
The bill has been circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill is now open for amendment at any point. Who seeks recognition for the purpose of offering an amendment? Mr. Poliquin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it very much. I'm pleased to offer this substitute amendment to my...
The clerk, Mr. Poliquin, we need the clerk to report.
I beg your pardon. An amendment to the nature of the, as the nature of the substitute.
Amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 3642, offered by Mr. Poliquin of Maine.
I ask unanimous consent that further reading of Mr. Poliquin's amendment in the nature of a substitute be dispensed with. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I now recognize Mr. Poliquin for 5 minutes to discuss his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you for your patience with me, Mr. Chairman. I'll eventually get this right. I'm pleased to offer this substitute amendment to my colleague, Congressman Andy Barr's Military Sexual Assault Victims Empowerment Act. This bill would create a pilot program to ensure that our veterans who have been sexually assaulted, Mr. Chairman, can not only receive the care and the support they deserve, but also have the option to freely choose their provider in the community if they do not want to receive the services at the VA. Now, this is common sense, and it makes sure that our victims have control over their care, not only in the place, but also with the providers with whom they feel safe. I ask all my colleagues to support this common sense bill and thank the Congressman Andy Barr for his thoughtful piece of legislation. Thank you, sir. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Poliquin. I will be supporting this amendment in the nature of a substitute. Do any members wish to comment? Hearing none, and since no other amendments were timely filed, the question now occurs on Representative Poliquin's amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3642. All those in favor of Mr. Poliquin's amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3642 say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3642 is agreed to. I now recognize Ranking Member Walls for a motion to report H.R. 3642 as amended.
Mr. Chairman, I move H.R. 3642 as amended be reported favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 3642 as amended is reported favorably to the full House. I now call up H.R. 3832, the Veterans Opioid Abuse Prevention Act. The clerk shall report.
H.R. 3832, to direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to enter into a memorandum of understanding with the Executive Director.
The bill was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill is open for amendment at any point. Who seeks recognition for offering an amendment? Dr. Dunn will state that he has an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Walz.
The clerk shall report.
An amendment in nature of substitute to H.R. 3832, offered by Mr. Dunn of Florida.
As unanimous consent, further reading of the amendment in the nature of a substitute be dispensed with. Hearing no objection, so ordered. And now yield 5 minutes to Dr. Dunn to discuss his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This substitute amendment simply clarifies the wording and causes this amendment to match the language of H.R. 5674, the Mission Act. It's a win for our veterans receiving their health care through the Veterans Health Administration. The Department of Veterans Affairs Healthcare Administration is the largest health care provider in the country and is in a unique position to lead the initiative to prevent opioid abuse, particularly among our nation's heroes. Currently, when a veteran receives a prescription for opioids through the VA doctors are only authorized to see prescribing information shared through their local state prescription drug monitoring programs, the PDMPs. The PDMPs improve a doctor's ability to identify and follow at-risk patients who may have a pattern of excessive prescription opioids. Unfortunately, the VA providers currently do not have the authority to share prescribing data across state lines or nationwide. My amendment to H.R. 3832 directs the VA to have healthcare providers participate in accessing prescription data across the network of interstate prescription PDMPs and matches the language in H.R. 5674, the Mission Act. This amendment language ensures that any time a VA doctor writes a prescription for a controlled substance, a VA provider will be able to consult data from across the United States. This language aligns with the White House's recommendation that the VA lead the efforts to have all state and federal PDMPs share information. The administration highlighted multiple published best practices for PDMPs and has identified this type of data sharing among PDMPs as a top priority to ensure that healthcare professionals have a better understanding of when they're prescribing controlled medications for their patients. The amendment ensures that the VA healthcare providers can fully utilize the tools that are currently available to provide the safest care for our veterans in every corner of our country. And I thank all of my colleagues who co-sponsored H.R. 3832, and I encourage all of us to support this amendment to H.R. 3832. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen, for yielding. I will be supporting this amendment in the nature of a substitute. Any other members wish to comment? Hearing none, and since no other amendments were timely filed, the question now occurs on Representative Dunn's amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3832. All those in favor of Dr. Dunn's amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3832 say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3832 is agreed to. I now recognize Ranking Member Walz for a motion to report H.R. 3832 as amended.
Mr. Chairman, I move H.R. 3832 as amended be reported favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 3832 as amended is reported favorably to the full House. I now call up H.R. 4635, a bill to direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to increase the number of peer-to-peer counselors providing counseling for women veterans. The clerk shall report.
H.R. 4635 to direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to increase the number of peer-to-peer
The bill was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill is open for amendment at any point. Who seeks recognition for the purpose of offering an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk shall report.
Amendment to nature of substitute to H.R. 4635, offered by Mr.
Unanimous consent that further reading of the amendment in the nature of a substitute be dispensed with. Hearing no objection, so ordered. And now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Kaufman to discuss his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Currently, female veterans make up 10% of our nation's veteran population, and that is expected to grow to 15% by 2030. As the female veteran population increases, it is critical for the VA to update and improve services for this growing female veteran population. An area in need of particular attention are the mental health services for female veterans. Unfortunately, many female veterans have experienced sexual trauma and PTSD while serving in the military. Many are also suffering from the mental health conditions and other mental health conditions and are at risk of homelessness. The VA's 2016 suicide data report found that the risk of suicide for female veterans was 2.4 times higher than non-veteran adult females, and the increased rates of suicide are more prevalent among women than men. We as a nation can do better. Mr. Chairman, peer support counseling can help female veterans who are facing these challenges, and we owe it to them to ensure sufficient resources for their gender-specific needs. My bill, H.R. 4635, the Peer-to-Peer Counseling Act, would do just that. After conversations with the VA, my amendment to H.R. 4635 would make technical changes to ensure the intent of H.R. 4635 is appropriately met. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment to better posture and update the peer support counseling program that will better represent the needs of our female veterans. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thanks, gentlemen, for yielding. I will be supporting this amendment in the nature of a substitute. Do any other members wish to comment? Hearing none, since no other amendments were timely filed, the question now occurs on Representative Kaufman's amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4635. All those in favor of Mr. Kaufman's amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4635 say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4635 is agreed to. And now recognize Ranking Member Walls for a motion to report H.R. 4635 as amended.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 4635 as amended be reported favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 4635 as amended is reported favorably to the full House. And now call up H.R. 5520, the VA Medicinal Cannabis Research Act of 2018. The clerk shall report.
H.R. 5520 to authorize the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to use the authority of the Secretary to conduct...
The bill was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. I am proud to be an original co-sponsor of this legislation, which is spearheaded by Ranking Member Walls. With so many veterans struggling with difficult-to-treat conditions like chronic pain and in light of the ongoing national opioid crisis, I'm keenly aware of the need for VA to critically examine possibly new treatments that could benefit veteran patients, and any patient really. Like all of us on this dais, I've heard from many veterans who believe that medical cannabis could help them lead fuller, healthier lives. Right now, we don't know if that's true or not. That's why I believe the VA should conduct rigorous, fact-based research on medical cannabis just like any other medication or treatment. Look, it is a chemical. It should be studied like any other chemical, and we as physicians should be given direction about what the black box warnings, indications, the contraindications are for this medication. And VA is uniquely positioned to conduct this important research and help find the answer once and for all as to whether medical cannabis is a safe and effective treatment for veterans and other Americans. I appreciate the efforts of the American Legion and others who have brought this issue to the forefront to our attention. And I appreciate Mr. Wall's tenacity on this bill. And I ask my colleagues to support the bill. And the bill is now open for amendment at any point who seeks recognition for the purpose of offering an amendment.
Do I go?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk shall report.
Amendment to H.R. 5520, offered by Mr. Wenstrup of Ohio.
Unanimous consent for further reading of the amendment be dispensed with. Hearing no objection, so ordered. And now recognize Dr. Wenstrup for 5 minutes to discuss his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment to H.R. 5520 would just reinforce the requirement for any research on medicinal cannabis that the Department of Veterans Affairs conducts to be in compliance with applicable regulations from VA, Department of Health and Human Services, the Food and Drug Administration, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and the National Institutes of Health. And that's all it would simply do.
Thank you. I will be supporting this amendment. Do any other members wish to comment? Mr. Walls, you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to begin by thanking you for your support of this legislation. As a physician, a scientist, your approach to this is greatly appreciated. And I want to say that the hope and the encouragement inside the veterans community by the movement of this legislation has been outstanding and overwhelming. To each of my colleagues here on the committee, thank you for your support as well. Regardless of where any of you stand on the cannabis issue, this legislation is a message first and foremost to our veterans that Congress is listening, that we're willing to explore every option and every opportunity for healing until we find the right solution. So even if you don't believe that cannabis is useful, our veterans deserve to know for sure. Congress deserves to know for sure. Each of the 30 states and territories currently allowing medical recommendations for cannabis and the remaining 21 states that aren't allowing this all deserve to know. The reason VA needs to be able to research cannabis is not just CBD or synthetic THC, is because cannabis, when viewed as a whole plant, consists of approximately 100 cannabinoids and various terpenes among hundreds of various chemicals and compounds. Medical providers and researchers remain in the dark on how these various compounds work together in what the industry has termed entourage effect. Until we know for sure how each part of the whole plant works, we can't fully understand the proper role of cannabis in medicine. That's why this research is so incredibly important. Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for your support. This is about providing answers to a potential pain reliever and healing for our veterans. They've been asking for it. Again, I too want to thank those veteran service organizations led by the American Legion and the VFW for asking for answers, and I encourage my colleagues to support this.
Yeah, Mr. Walls, I'm amazed we waited this long to study this issue. Do any other members wish to
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Cray, you recognize.
Thank you very much, Chairman. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Waltz and Mr. Chairman for working on this issue. And I started working on cannabis and veterans probably about 5, 6 years ago when I was chair of Veterans Affairs Committee in the California State Senate. And let me say to our veterans, this legislation is led by you. Because in those days when I was chairing Veterans Affairs, I started getting veterans coming into my office and saying, we prefer cannabis to opioids to treat our invisible wounds. This is what we want. And all of us know that cannabis is good for treating epilepsy, for treating seizures. We just don't know what else it's good for. You ask our VA, please tell us, do the research. They're apprehensive. Why? Because at federal level, cannabis is classified as a Class 1 drug, and everybody's scared to death to do research on this matter. Israel is doing it. Canada is just a few months away from making cannabis fully legal. California fully legal. In this country, more than half of our population lives under a jurisdiction, state jurisdiction, that permits cannabis one way or the other. So for the benefit of our veterans, it's important that we clarify for the VA that they can legally do research into what cannabis is good for and what cannabis is not good for. The second part of this legislation that I think is critical is it's going to ask the VA to come back and tell us how they use that authority to do research. We just don't want to give the VA this authority and then have them sit on it. We want them to do the research and to report back to this committee, this legislature, as to what they came up with. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and Mr. Waltz for your good work on this measure, and let's move ahead.
I thank the gentleman for his comments. Anyone else like to comment on the bill? Hearing none, and since no other amendments were timely filed, the question now occurs on Dr. Winstrup's amendment to H.R. 5520. All those in favor of Dr. Winstrup's amendment to H.R. 5520 say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment to H.R. 5520 is agreed to. I now recognize Ranking Member Walls for a motion to report H.R. 5520 as amended.
Mr. Chairman, I move H.R. 5520 as amended be reported favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 5520 as amended is reported favorably to the full House. We have several non-controversial measures that can be reported to the House en bloc, and I'm sure most of y'all are disappointed in that. I ask unanimous consent to call up and consider en bloc H.R. 4245, H.R. 4334, H.R. 4451 as amended, H.R. 4830 as amended, H.R. 4958, H.R. 5044, H.R. 5215, H.R. 5418. Hearing no objection, so ordered. The clerk shall report.
H.R. 4245, to direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to submit to Congress certain documents.
Bills were circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. I ask that the reading of the bills be dispensed with. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Do any members wish to comment on the bills remaining on our agenda? Mr. Walz.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, incredible markup, great effort at moving things. Thank you for including that. I just want to take a point of personal privilege on a piece you've added again for me on H.R. 4245, the Veterans Electronic Health Record Modernization Act of 2017. When I came to Congress in 2007, I remember one of the first hearings in February of that year, I talked about why we didn't have DOD and VA on the same medical record that could communicate with one another. And fast forward about 10 years later, when then Secretary Shulkin sat in that chair right there and told this committee that we were going to move forward, the contract was going to be put out, and we were going to move forward with one joint electronic medical record. This bill ensures that once VA signs the contract with Cerner, the new VA electronic health record, Congress will receive the reports and information we need to conduct proper oversight to keep this going. This is a minimum of a 10-year project. It's budgeted somewhere in the terms of, I'm guessing, will approach nearly $20 billion. It will impact every aspect of VA health care. And I just want to tell you this, why this is so important. Some of you have been following this. I have learned a new name in this process, and that is Dr. Bruce Moskowitz, who apparently has a membership at Mar-a-Lago and is an internship and has an opinion in electronic medical records, which Dr. Moskowitz has the right to do that. But apparently, through his friendship, he is able to be on 3 calls every month or so with Ike Perlmutter, who is making decisions on this. Then Secretary Shulkin said, who the hell are these people? And that is why we're slowing down implementation. That's not the way this is supposed to work. Decisions were made. Congress has oversight. We have a private citizen with access to the President that is making decisions about the joint electronic medical record. So for all of us here, I question no one here and their commitment to getting this right, but I remind all of us, every single thing we send up there, including the Mission Act, will have rule writing that will be done by people outside of this area. This piece of legislation simply brings back the authority of the oversight onto us to keep the purpose of that moving forward and to make sure we don't run into a cost overrun situation. So I thank the Chairman for bringing in. I think the Chairman has as much knowledge on electronic medical records as anybody in government. I trust him to have the oversight in this. I trust his committee to have it, and I ask for your support.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Now, Mr. Bilirakis, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I'd like to thank the Chairman, of course, and the ranking member for bringing my legislation, H.R. 4830, the SIT-REP bill, up for today's markup. I'd also like to thank my colleagues on the other side, again, the ranking member and the ranking member of the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee, Mr. O'Rourke, and my colleague, Ms. Custer, for being the original co-sponsors on my bill. My bill, the Service Members Improved Transition Through Reforms for Ensuring Progress Act, or the SIT-REP Act, was created in response to concerns we heard from VSO stakeholders, such as the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, or TAPS, regarding delayed payments and processing time for GI payments by both the school and the VA. In some cases, delays meant schools putting a hold on students' account or start forcing the student to begin paying the tuition and fees on a payment plan until they receive money from VA. H.R. 4830, the SIT-REP Act, would give the Secretary the authority to disapprove course of education for the GI Bill unless the education institution adopts a policy ensuring that it will not deny veterans access to education. The VA has the authority to waive this requirement as it sees fit, and this policy would only apply if the payment have not been, if the payments have not been received within 90 days of the beginning of the term. The SIT-REP Act is common sense, bipartisan. It's a bipartisan bill that protects student veterans and their families who, through no fault of their own, are denied access to education because the school made a mistake or the VA made a late payment. It is not the veterans' fault, and they should not be punished for the actions of others. In closing, I remain dedicated to ensuring that our nation's veterans have access to the important educational benefits they have earned and deserve. As these brave men and women fought on our behalf, we have a responsibility to do the same by ensuring that they are held harmless from bureaucratic penalties and fees. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for bringing this bill up, and I urge support, and hopefully this gets on the floor of the House very soon and is passed by the Senate and signed by the President. Again, I heard about this in one of my roundtables, my veteran roundtables. Again, the veterans should not have to be penalized for a mistake made by the school or the VA. So I appreciate it very much if we can get this done as soon as possible. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
And I thank the gentleman. Do any other members wish to comment on any of the pieces of legislation that are in the en bloc? Okay. I now recognize Ranking Member Walsh for a motion to report H.R. 4245, H.R. 4334, H.R. 4451 as amended, H.R. 4830 as amended, H.R. 4958, H.R. 5044, H.R. 5215, H.R. 5418 favorably to the House.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 4245, H.R. 4334, H.R. 4451 as amended, H.R. 4830 as amended, H.R. 4958, H.R. 5044, H.R. 5215, and H.R. 5418 be reported favorably to the House of Representatives.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 4245, H.R. 4334, H.R. 4451 as amended, H.R. 4830 as amended, H.R. 4958, H.R. 5044, H.R. 5215, and H.R. 5418 are favorably reported to the House. Also, just a couple of comments. I know one of our colleagues is recovering from some surgery, Aunt Miss Custer, and I want to wish her nothing but the very best. I know she's had I know she wishes she could have been here today to be with us, and we just want to wish her the very best in her recovery. And I want to tell her, because she's had a hip operation, to move her legs, get out of the bed, and all those things that she needs to be doing. And I want to thank everyone here, both sides of the aisle, the last 15, 16 months as we worked. Our staffs have worked very hard. As you can see, we have gone through a tremendous amount of legislation today. That required a lot of work on both the minority staff and the majority staff and on the members. I think this, quite frankly, if we can get this to the President's desk by Memorial Day, is a historic day on the Veterans Affairs Committee. And I want to thank every single one of you for your commitment to our nation's heroes. Having just left those beaches at Normandy means a lot to me personally and to, I think, to this country. So thank you, thank you, thank you. That concludes our business today. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous materials on any of the bills reported today. Hearing no objection so ordered, I also ask unanimous consent that the committee staff be authorized to make technical and clerical and conforming changes to the bills reported this morning, and hearing no objection so ordered. Dissenting and minority additional views must be delivered to the clerk by 9 a.m. on Friday, May 11th. Thank the members for their attendance this morning, and the committee is adjourned.
Well done. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Good job.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Good job.
What a day. What a day.